It was 3 or 4 Saturdays ago. You remember the weekend when we were threatened horrible weather. We were all going to be snowed or iced in, and it didn't happen. That Saturday morning, I got a phone call from a friend who invited Melissa and me to her home for a dinner party that evening. She said, "I know you don't have any plans. You thought you were going to be snowed in all weekend." Right, so we went. Small dinner party, just 3 couples. My friend lives in the Sovereign, which is a luxury high-rise condo right in the middle of Buckhead. Spectacular. Her home is, I think, on the 38th floor. Melissa and I got there before the other couple. We went up, and we were just gawking. The view was unbelievable. Windows everywhere. My friend was cooking. She was at the stove. Her husband setting the table. They were kind of busy. Melissa and I were no help at all because we just had our nose to the window looking. It was breathtaking. When it became dark, we saw lights in this direction that were downtown Marietta. And then this direction, it was Dunwoody. On around, all the way back around here, we could see Stone Mountain. We were just struck. And my friend said, "It is so fun to have guests over because we've lived here for a while, and after a while, you start taking this for granted. It's fun to have guests come over and remind us by being wowed what we take for granted because we're here every day." And it struck me that the parables of Jesus can be like that for us because they have become so familiar. We've heard them since we were kids, that we might have stopped being wowed by them, even though they are wowing. And so we forget to be surprised and amazed by these incredibly powerful stories, and we just take them like a view from the kitchen window, not a big deal. But today, we've got another shocker, another jolting work of art. But it is another one of those parables that requires some explanation to be understood. This one, unlike last week, is just chock full of stuff we've got to explain. And I know explaining a parable is kind of like explaining a joke. It takes a little of the fizz out of it. But if I don't explain it, I might as well preach it in Portuguese, because there's all this stuff in there that we don't get. For instance, it features slaves, and we've got to interpret slavery. I mean, just the word makes us squirm, and understandably so. But it needs some unpacking because Palestinian slavery was different in so many ways than our images of American slavery. Slavery was prominent throughout the Mediterranean world, including Palestine, and Jewish slaves often served Jewish masters. Slavery was not based on race at all. Slaves were treated as full persons. They were often educated, owned property, had high positions. But still, they were subject to the master. Make no mistake. At the master's whim, a Palestinian slave could get really harsh treatment. But our image of slavery is chains and hammers and fields and bricks. The guys in this parable are not that kind of slave at all. They were not laborers. They were managerial slaves, skilled and trusted. So it would not have shocked the original hearers to hear a parable about managerial slaves given charge over the master's property while he was away. Not shocking. But the amount they were given charge of, that's a different matter. A talent. Here's another part of the parable that needs some translating. So I did some careful calculation of the currency, and a talent is a big boatload full of money. It's a lot of money. A talent is equal to about 600 days of wage for a laborer. So more or less, probably a little less. $500,000 or so in today's currency. That's what 5 talents would be equal to. But a talent is a unit of money. It is not the ability to play the tuba. And that gets a little confusing. So for years, preachers would preach this sermon, and they would talk about slaves and their big bags of money, and then the sermon would go something like this. You have talents too. Your talents may not be big sacks of money. Your talents, and they do this little crossover, might not be monetary at all. Your talent might be public speaking or macrame or playing the kazoo. They would say the slave invested his talent. Now his talent was money, but your talent might be something else, the ability to paint or draw. And eventually the word talent started being used differently. Sermon after sermon making that transfer, and then all of a sudden people said, look, Tom can juggle 2 eggs and a hatchet. That must be his talent. And the word had changed meaning. And now we use the word talent to mean a special aptitude or ability. But in this parable and for centuries after, a talent was just a big wad of cash. The parable is about money. And the master calls in the trusted managerial servants. He gives to one of them 5 talents, to another 2, another 1, to each according to his ability, his dynamis in Greek, his power. Then he went away, giving no instructions at all, giving no explicit expectations. And the man who's got the 5 talents, at once, he gets out, moving, trading, doing business. He makes another 500 grand. The man with the 2 talents, again, he is out there using what was given to him, the money that was given, and he doubles his money. He makes another 200 grand. But the man who got the 1 talent dug a hole, buried his fortune, kept it safe. And that's not an odd choice. In fact, it was common practice. Rabbi Samuel says in the rabbinic law, money can only be guarded by placing it in the earth. And excavations years after have unearthed many places where people had buried their money in the backyard. So the third man was simply doing what people in that culture did to safeguard a treasure. And some years later, the master arrives back at home. He asks the slaves to come in to show the books and the ledgers. And the one who's been given 5 talents races in. He can't wait to get there. He's so eager to tell his story. He was given 5 talents, and he told the master, guess what? I've doubled the money. I've got another 500 grand. Well done, said the master. You are a sound and reliable servant. And the servant with 2 talents comes rushing in right behind him. He's breathless. He can't wait to tell him. And he says, you gave me 200 grand? And here's another 200. Guess what? I doubled it. Well done. You're a sound and reliable servant. You've been trustworthy over a few things. I'm going to put you in charge of many. Come in, share your master's pleasure. And the man with 1 talent shuffles in. Sir, I always knew you were a hard man. Reaping where you never sowed, and collecting where you never laid out. So I was scared. I went off. I hid your 100 grand in the ground, but here's your money, all of it. It's intact, just like the way you left it. You are a wicked, lazy servant. You say I reap where I never sowed, but you could have put my money in the bank. You could have bought some low-interest CDs or something. You could have at least gotten a little return on my money. Take this talent, give it to the man who has 10, for to all those who have, more will be given. They will have an abundance. But for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless slave into the darkness where he can weep and wail over his stupidity. When I first read the parable this morning, I ask you to listen out for what we already know about parables. And you probably caught a lot already. Likely you caught the size and absurdity that's in this parable. And we've talked about that that's characteristic of Jesus' parables. Gives a slave $500,000. Everything's big, oversized. And then the whooping size of his actions. Worthless slave, throw him into the darkness. Everything's outrageous. Big, staggering cash amounts. Loud actions and consequences. There's nothing subtle in this parable at all. It's kind of cartoon-like. Richie Rich and Wile E. Coyote. Big. You probably also caught the rule of 3. We talked about it last week. The literary formula that lists things in threes, and the first two are foils that set up the third. A Brit, a Frenchman, and a Russian are in a rowboat. You know the Russian is going to be the punchline, or the one who satisfies the story. But did you notice the twist in today's parable? Remember, there's always a twist in the parables of Jesus, something to put us off balance. Last week, you recall, the twist was that the third character didn't go with the other two characters. That was last week's unexpected curveball, but that's not it this week at all. One he gave 5 talents, another he gave 2 talents, another he gave 1 talent, each according to their ability. All of those are alike. Today's twist, the late-breaking curveball today, is that the last character doesn't satisfy the story. He's not the hero. The last character in the rule of 3 is almost always designed to either satisfy the punchline or to be the hero. It's constructed so that the last one always looks good. All right, I'll reach into your deep literary background to illustrate. It was not the first Billy Goat Gruff. It wasn't the middle Billy Goat Gruff, but the third, the older, the bigger Billy Goat Gruff who tosses the troll over the bridge, and we have a hero. The first little pig built his house with straw. And the second little pig built his house with twigs. The third little pig built his house with bricks. We've got a hero. And the wolf could not huff and puff and blow it down. Last week, the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Levite walks by the side of the road, doesn't help. The priest walks by, doesn't help. But the third one, the Samaritan, and we have a hero. That's the way it's supposed to work. But once again, Jesus turns the tables, flips the parable on its head. The third one is not a hero at all. And this parable does a double surprise. And that is, the other surprise in this parable is that the underdog does not win. Stories are much more satisfying when the underdog wins. The tortoise is supposed to beat the hare in a parable. What is satisfying about a rabbit outrunning a turtle? Underdogs are supposed to win. And this is particularly surprising from the lips of Jesus. Because Jesus is the ultimate champion of the disadvantaged. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is caring for the left out, those on the margins, the poor, the sick, the children, the women, the good folks called sinners. Jesus always elevates the underdog. See that widow over there who has just put her last mite into the offering plate? She has given more than all. Today's parable is the singular exception. This is the one case where the one with the least loses. Which makes this not sound so much like Jesus. I mean, the little guy, the one who's not as sharp as the others in his class, seems to get it worse in the end. It sounds a little bit like Judge Smales in Caddyshack saying, well, Danny Noonan, the world needs some ditch diggers too. You know, just if you're down, just be down. The one-talent slave was afraid of his master. He digs and quivers and hides and explains because he thinks of the master as a despot. But everything leading up depicts the master as extraordinary. He's trusting and welcoming and generous and benevolent. And keep in mind, this is a culture where slaves are expected to do their duty without any praise at all. They're not expected to get praise or getting written up in the company newsletter or get a participation trophy. They're supposed to do what they're supposed to do. And yet this master gives them tribute, gives them increased authority. Some interpreters believe verse 28 suggests they were allowed to keep the money. In any case, the master seems to be the opposite of the uncaring despot who is depicted by the one-talent slave. The parable declares the possibility of joyous freedom under great grace and asks the most central, most penetrating question. What did you do with what I gave you? Given the shocking size of the currency you hold, what did you do with what I gave you? If your Christian experience is not lived in abundant delight and freedom, if your Christian experience is lived in fear, it might be that you have the wrong image of the Master. He is generous and trusting and delighting in the ways you risk, delighting in the ways you take a leap to advance the kingdom. And if you're afraid of the Master, you might have the wrong image of the Master. There's a quote that's attributed to Carlyle Marney that I hope is true. Carlyle Marney was one of the great Baptist legends of an era ago. And the story is that Dr. Marney was engaged in conversation with an atheist. And he said to the unbeliever, "Tell me about the God you don't believe in. Chances are I don't believe in him either." In other words, there are a lot of people operating with a distorted view of God. And in this parable, God is the generous giver who delights and celebrates our risk to expand the gospel. God is the one who extends freedom and trust and is even willing to risk staggering sums into our care. But the parable pushes us with the same question. And the answer to the question means that it either ends in festive celebration or in outer darkness. But the question remains the same. Given the shocking size of the currency you hold, what did you do with what I gave you?